So a couple of days ago in Florence, Italy, I was walking through an olive garden. I was just outside of Florence, actually. And I was listening to the Jordan Peterson Slavoj Žižek debate. It was framed as a debate, but I think it was something more like a, um, a meeting of minds. It was an event, which is to say that something new happened, something novel transpired. And anyways, in my brief little reaction video, I was, throwing out some first takes, and I didn't give a lot of details. I didn't really show my work. And so I wanted to follow up, and unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, this is going to be a brief video as well, but I wanted to lay out some of the reasons that I had the response to the debate that I did, or to the event. Because as many people have pointed out, what was sold as a debate actually turned out to be more of, I think, a valuable discussion, a conversation even. Certainly in their opening statements, Peterson and Zizek totally talked past one another, but when they started to engage in conversation, it was clear that they agreed about a lot, that 20th century communism had failed. They agreed that the way that identity politics and political correctness manifest in the public sphere at present, that it's regressive, that it's not helping the human species move forward in a productive way. They agreed also that happiness isn't really the end of human life, or shouldn't be. It might be a byproduct, but for Peterson, the end is meaning, and for Zizek, it's not clear what the end is, really. He's more of, I would say, an ontological pessimist. He's a materialist, and for him, he's a dialectical materialist, right? Which is this sort of philosophy underlying Marx's political ideology. And so for Zizek, his materialism sounds a lot like idealism, namely Hegel's absolute idealism, which again is dialectical in form, and which, rather than as the Cartesian would, and as natural science and a kind of base materialism, I'll call it, rather a naive materialism rather than a dialectical materialism, this Cartesian philosophy, mechanistic philosophy, right? It tends to view matter as something that is knowable and that can be fully rationalized. And Zizek doesn't think that matter is knowable. Matter for him is precisely in the Lacanian sense, Jacques Lacan, right, this psychoanalyst, French psychoanalyst that he inherits, which you can think of Lacan as kind of what happens when you put Freud and Heidegger into a particle accelerator, and you collide them at high speed and you see what results. That's basically Lacan's psychology. And Lacan referred to this tripartite reality, and these three parts of reality are the imaginal, the symbolic, and the real. And these are psychological registers for Lacan, because he's a psychoanalyst. He's examining what the human being, what comes to presence in what comes. Presence is a sticky term for a Heideggerian, but rather what unveils itself in the beingness of our existence. For Lacan, for Heidegger, it takes this threefold shape. I know Heidegger spoke of a fourfold. Anyways, we're getting lost in minutiae here, right? But the point is that for Lacan, the real, or we might say the material, it withdraws completely from our ability to know it, whether imaginally, that is, with our senses, or symbolically, that is, with our language, with our sociality, with the linguistic, the shared linguistic realm of ideas, right? That human beings constitute with one another so as to give sense to their sensory experience. So, right, so there's the symbolic, there's the imaginal, and there's the real. And so Zizek, when talking about the real, yeah, it's material, but it's unknowable. It's an abyss. It is sublime and in that sense terrifying. And yet what the human being does is, in relating to this terror, the human being constitutes a symbolic order. And that symbolic order operates upon our organism, upon our life, as a kind of wound, as a kind of tear, a gap, a gaping wound, if you will. And all of human civilization is this struggle, right, as Freud suggested, between the rational, conscious human mind and this abyssal nature that we know constitutes what we are ultimately, but that we can never really know, right? So we, in some sense, as conscious beings, necessarily repress what's called the unconscious, and that unconscious is precisely nature. And Zizek kind of leaves us there with this wound, with this ontological horror, and he offers nothing constructive. Peterson does offer something constructive. Meaning is his highest or ultimate value, right? And for him, the locus of this meaning is the individual. And the individual is on this heroic quest, in many ways, against their society, and it goes without speaking, against nature, trying to somehow bootstrap themselves into a transcendent union with the Godhead, right? And yes, God ultimately creates everything, and I think Peterson seems to have a sort of Jungian psychological understanding of what God is, such that it's not something outside of our consciousness, but at the same time our consciousness can't help but come into relationship with its own transcendent ground. Peterson doesn't ultimately give us a cosmology, he gives us a metapsychology, I think. It's this heroic story. Joseph Campbell, when people say, oh, what do you think of Jordan Peterson? I'm like, well, what's of value in Peterson is what you could have gotten from watching, Joseph Campbell's PBS special. And it's that, in a way, death, rebirth experience of initiation that it's true our culture lacks. And Peterson's providing that for a lot of people, especially for white men who feel increasingly alienated from the popular culture of 2019. So Peterson and Zizek were unprepared. I think Zizek was more prepared. Peterson was unprepared for Zizek, who he assumed was a standard Marxist who was somehow pushing forward the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which is all that Peterson has ever read of Marx. And Zizek is not this at all, nor are most of the Marxist intellectuals or post-Marxist intellectuals who engage with the critique of capitalism and the attempt to imagine an alternative. Whether they're in academia or they're para-academics or they're just autodidacts, people who engage with Marx's work have moved far beyond what Marx said, and certainly have read more of Marx than just the 1848 Manifesto. So Peterson critiques, or I wouldn't even say critiques, he criticizes Marx and says that it's like an undergraduate paper, or that he even says, he's read undergraduate papers that were better, argued than Marx. So he credits Marx for his literary and rhetorical acumen. But at the same time, it's like Peterson just finished admitting to the fact that he didn't even try to engage with Zizek's corpus, and that he only read one of Marx's essays, and it's a the Communist Manifesto is a deliberately propagandistic document. Marx was asked to deliver a speech to a collection of workers who were organizing against capital. And here's the thing: in the 1840s, in Europe, especially in England and in Germany and elsewhere, the conditions that workers were being subjected to were, let's just say, inhumane, right? And anyone who looks at the conditions of workers during the 1840s and the whole, I mean, not just workers, paid workers, at least they were paid, right? In the United States, you had, at least by 1860, something like 4 million slaves working for free in labor camps, picking the cotton that was shipped over to England. 70% of the cotton imported by London in 1860 came from the United States. So you have capitalism, global capitalism, coming into its own in the mid-1800s, fueled by the raw materials picked by slaves, produced in factories by workers who were barely able to afford food. And they're organizing to rebel against the owners, the capitalists, the ones who were exercising the economic power that gave birth to this industrial revolution. The economic power, the money, the actual energy was being delivered day after day for 12-hour shifts, not just by adults, but by children. There were no labor laws. There were no wage minimums. This was just raw capitalism, unencumbered by state intervention, and it was starving people. And so, yes, 20th century communism failed. But capitalism in the 19th century also failed. And it was because workers revolted against the conditions imposed upon them by this economic system that the semblance of some humane treatment of workers, of something approaching a living wage, and something approaching reasonable working conditions and safety and so on, was achieved only because the workers revolted. Okay, so Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto in the context of this historical moment, right, where capital was eating the life of the workers, just blatantly, right, and enslaving millions of people. Right? To say that slavery is somehow outside of the capitalist world order in the mid-1800s is to be in complete denial of the material and social facts. Right? Take a look at them. So, if Peterson wants to understand Marx's thought, he's going to need to read more than the Capitalist Manifesto. And when you put the Capitalist Manifesto in its historical context, you see why Marx was justified in saying the things that he said. Yeah, 170 years later, it doesn't read so well after Lenin and Stalin and Mao and so on, right? But Peterson, to attack Marx and Marxists based on a shallow reading of a single, deliberately, ideologically provocative essay, a political speech, is the equivalent of what you would expect from a freshman undergraduate who didn't do the reading and tried to watch a few YouTube videos before turning in a paper. That's just the fact of the matter, and that's why in my initial reaction I was really critical of Peterson. Now, if we move past his opening statement, it's clear with Peterson sitting there in awe of Zizek that he learned something. And so when I say that Zizek schooled Peterson, that's all I mean, and I think I should have said it in a way that made it clear that I think Peterson also would acknowledge that he learned something. It turns out, after 170 years, that Marxists kept thinking and kept responding to history, and that the political application of Marx's ideas in the 20th century were not the only way of interpreting and then applying Marx's ideas. right? And when you read the full complexity of Marx's later works, Capital, for instance, you see how aware he was of everything that Peterson was saying. And I mean, for Peterson to say that Marx simply reduces history to economic class struggle is to totally ignore the things that he said about nature, about soil and the productivity of the soil, about creativity, and about history. I mean, yes, he's a materialist, and he's a dialectical materialist, right? Not the sort of naive materialism that I described as Cartesian earlier. And Zizek is also dialectical in his materialism. But I don't ultimately agree with Marx's materialism, right? I'm a panpsychist, I'm a Whiteheadian, and there are ways of reading dialectical materialism as more than materialism, as something closer to the sort of Whiteheadian process relational ontology that I often talk about on my channel here and in all of my academic work. So I'm not a Marxist. I'm not even a Hegelian. I'm not a Zizekian. And so my critiques of Peterson are not saying that I somehow think Zizek has it right. I think his pessimism is corrosive to our humanity at this moment, and that we need something, we need a source of ontological hope, which is to say that we need to find a way of feeling at home again in the universe. And, you know, it's very easy to be cynical about our human capacity to get in touch with this deeper dimension of the universe. It's very easy to be a critic of cultural ideology, including New Age spirituality and westernized Buddhism and all the things that Zizek attacks and belittles. And I think we can do better than that. I think Carl Jung, and depth psychology and archetypal studies have a lot to teach us about our mythic roots and the symbol systems and the traditions that we have inherited. A Jungian perspective on all that, like what Peterson offers, and again, like what Campbell offered, I think, in a more profound way, even in The Power of Myth, right? And all of his more scholarly work. Campbell gives us what Peterson is trying to give us. So I really encourage people into Peterson to just return to Campbell's work and study that more deeply. But we need meaning, and I think we can get it from depth psychology, we can get it from evolutionary cosmology, and we need to find a way of activating these new worldviews, this new sense of hope in the human spirit, of activating it beyond just the psychological realm or the personal realm. And, you know, as a motivational speaker, as a self-help guru, I think Peterson is great, and he's clearly helped a lot of people, especially young men, find themselves. And then the challenge is, well, how do we apply this socially? How do we understand the 21st century individual in their social context? Because culture is more than just an individual game. Culture making is more than just an individual game. And yes, the locus of value that Peterson finds in the individual, it's valid. But where is the individual? Within what context is the individual situated? And is the hero's journey the complete response to the situation, the locus within which the individual comes to be? Because the individual comes to be, the individual, the hero, is born from a mother, from a family, from a culture, from a matrix, from a maternal womb. The individual is born out of that and dies into that. And so I feel like if we just leave off with clean your room, we're totally alienating ourselves from, cutting ourselves off from the encompassing background of that story, which has everything to do with ecology, which has everything to do with what Marx was striving for, which is an understanding of the human individual in relationship to their society and to nature. For Peterson to say that nature doesn't exist in Marxist thought is just foolish. We might not finally be happy with Marx's treatment of nature, but to say that it's not present in his thought is foolish. And so finally, I would just say that if Peterson wants to engage seriously with Marx, especially the contemporary state of the art in Marxist thought, he should read the ecological Marxists. Jason Moore wrote a book recently called Capitalism and the Web of Life. Study that. There's research by Marxists on what's called the metabolic rift. Read about that. To say, as Peterson does, that profit is good, and this is just my final statement here, to say that profit is good because it's kind of like this metric or this check that makes sure that business owners never engage in forms of stupidity, because the market will correct for that stupidity and drive them out of business, right? And people clap at this, and I'm like, are you seriously saying that capitalism, that consumer capitalism doesn't reward stupid products? And that the vast majority of what consumer capitalism produces is completely wasteful and extravagant and decadent and kitsch and stupid? I mean, putting aside all of consumer culture around, fashion, the fashion industry and the fast food industry and all these things, and just looking at like fossil fuel production, if the science on climate change is even like half right in terms of the general picture that it's painting, even if it's 25% right, and I know to use percentages in this way, let's just say that they're onto something at least a little bit. For us to continue to allow and even to reward oil companies for extracting and sending to market for it to be burned, like all the oil that remains in the reserves that they've already capitalized in the financial markets, if that's not stupid, I don't know what is. And the thing is about the critique of centralization and the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and how could they possibly be intelligent enough to make all of the decisions in advance that would allow goods and services to be distributed equitably and so on. The idea that capitalism, I agree with the critique of centralization. And it was naive for anyone to believe that somehow proletarian workers were intrinsically good, right, and would be able to run a society freely. And I don't think Marx actually believed that. And so again, Peterson is tilting at windmills. He's created a straw man for himself that's easy to blow over. Marx had a much more sophisticated understanding of human nature and didn't want to eliminate or think that eliminating hierarchy was possible. Didn't want to undermine individual freedom. He wanted to provide the conditions that made it possible for human beings to compete as like friendly enemies. Like there are certain social conditions that make that possible, and to the extent that the capitalist world order has succeeded at all, it's because the human being has the nature that makes it want to cooperate at least a little bit. Capitalism pushes against those better instincts and reduces us more and more to greedy, self-absorbed, depressed, isolated selves, egos. So Marx's anthropology is just far more nuanced and intricate than Peterson even understands. And for him to attacking the students, the undergraduates who protest at Peterson's events is one thing. Attacking ideas like Marx and the whole German idealist tradition that informed Marx without even bothering to read any of it, I think is unfortunate, right? And so that's why I react so strongly to this exchange between Peterson and Zizek. I just think Peterson didn't do his homework. He just didn't. So, you know, I'm not a Marxist, right? Ultimately, and I've posted plenty of videos about this that you can go watch, I think we need to decentralize power. But I also think doing that means fighting back against the capitalist world order, which, if you're worried about centralization, why aren't you worried about Davos? Why aren't you worried about a few transnational corporations designing the economy, the global economy? Why aren't you worried about a handful of billionaires owning more wealth than 90% of the rest of the world? That's the centralization of power. And I'm not saying a dictatorship of the proletariat is going to solve it, but we need a fucking solution to that problem. And, you know, the left-right spectrum politically, with whatever, I don't know, communists on one side and capitalists on the other side or whatever, is so, it's just such a distraction from the issues that we really need to be dealing with as human beings on planet Earth at this particular historical moment. And so I hope that this event between Zizek and Peterson will allow us to step into a new kind of conversation. So, yeah, there you have it. There's my more nuanced take, I hope. And I'm happy to hear what you think about it.